Okay, our speaker, Aubrey Karajan. Okay, Aubrey has a Bachelor of Science degree in the Science of Natural and Environmental Systems from Cornell University. And after doing forest ecology research in academia and arid land restoration in the public sector, she founded Ungardening Native Plants in her hometown of Durham. Tonight, she will introduce to us the idea of ungardening. She will discuss with us what a weed really is, invasive species, and how to deal with them. Thank you.
Am I good? All right. Well, thank you all so much for having me. It's awesome to be here. As Beverly said, my name is Aubrey Karajan, and I am from Connecticut, born and raised. Went away to college, did that thing where I was pretty convinced I was going to go into academia. So I was a technician for a few years, and then realized as important as scientific research is, and as much as I love it, the rate of ecological collapse that I was seeing around us made me I couldn't put myself back in that ivory tower. I needed to get out and bring all this stuff I learned and give it to everybody else. So I came back here. As Beverly said, I started Ungardening. And I also work kind of full-time as a field botanist. So I travel all around the state, identifying plants and protecting rare plants and managing for invasive species. Yes.
We
Am I
need,
too far?
we need to share your screen.
Oh, okay. All right. Got a couple books to pull up at the end and show you in my bag. So the conversation around native plants really tends to focus on pollinators, but my vision of Ungardening, should I wait until I get up to the microphone? Okay.
People on Zoom will be with you.
Oh, okay.
If you don't stay.
I'll be patient. I'll try. Not very good. That's why I'm not much of a bird watcher. You'll notice I have a lot of pictures, not many of birds, because I can't sit myself still long enough, but I've got flowers and bugs to share with you.
Where do we go?
All right. So what is ungardening? Ungardening is both a land care ethic and a method. So it's a land care ethic that asks us to consider our yards not just as outdoor rooms, like is kind of traditional, but to consider them as part of the greater ecosystem. And it's a method that uses biomimicry, so basically a fancy word for copying nature, and restoration ecology to return ecological function to our yards. So instead of necessarily treating our yards like gardens, how can we actually manage them like wild areas? So ungardening recognizes that plants are the foundation on which a healthy ecosystem is built. You can't just beg the birds to come to your yard, you need something for them. So by encouraging native plants and these natural processes, we can build these healthy soils and the habitat for our pollinators and other beneficial wildlife. And ungardening requires us to take our cues from nature and operate at nature's pace. We really like to kind of, as soon as it gets warm, put things that are blooming in the ground. You'll notice a lot of the things that have been blooming for the last month aren't native. So our native species have learned that it's often pretty likely to get a freeze now or a little later. So they don't want to leaf out necessarily before that freeze is going to happen. our beautiful ornamental things we love because they don't have that trait. They're not tied to the daylight, they're tied to the temperature. So by taking our cues from nature and following along with nature steps, we're working with it instead of against it. And I'm going to get into this a whole lot more, but I kind of just want to start with where the conversation right now really is, and that's pollinators. So here's the number one most commonly talked about pollinator. And this group probably knows that that's not native. That's a honeybee. They're livestock. Wild honeybees you'll see out and about are the ecological equivalent to a stray cat or a feral cow. They're not really a native species that we want to be protecting, but who are these other pollinators other than just the bees? Well, of course, we have our butterflies, we have our monarchs, we have our eastern tiger swallowtails. So if you know these two species, you may know that they have really close relationships with an individual plant. But if you know your plant ID, you may recognize that that's not milkweed that monarch's on, and that's not anything in the carrot family that eastern tiger swallowtail is on. And that's because those specialist relationships are actually, they're important for the larva, but the adult can use a wide variety of host plants. So we think about these specialist relationships, and we're often tied like, oh, to help the monarchs, we just plant milkweed. But they need more than just milkweed. Milkweed's necessary for the caterpillars, but they need blooms that are going to be there the whole time that those butterflies are there. The same with the eastern tiger swallowtails. So right here, that is not a bee. That's a wasp, and wasps are really important pollinators too. People really, really like to give them a lot of guff, but really only a pretty small number of species are actually aggressive. A lot of our wasps are solitary, just like many of our native bees, and they're not defending a hive. Their goal, if they're getting into a tussle with you, is to survive. When you have those colonial wasps, their goal is to protect the hive, so they don't care if they die. They're willing to sacrifice themselves to get you out of there, whereas the solitary wasp would rather just go the other way. All right, we've got here another little sweat bee. So it kind of looks like a fly, but it's got this shiny little green butt. And all of these, so the honeybee up there is on a crabapple, the rest, which is a non-native species, the rest are on some native flowers. So New York ironweed for the monarch, one of our Joe Pye weeds, and then we've got white wood aster and virgin bower clematis. And now we, of course, have our bumblebees, who this time of year, they're really the native bees that are needing the most help. So that is a native bumblebee on monkey flower. We've got this, which actually isn't a bee. The picture's a little, you have to trust the picture. You see those two wings? Those truly are the only two wings. That's a flower fly. So they're a fly that mimics the bees and does the same job. And on this flower, we actually have a regular old housefly. So pollinators, here we have those tiny little annoying ants that are always bothering our houses. Well, they work as pollinators too. And ants are actually really, really important seed distributors for a lot of our spring ephemerals. So if you've ever seen a bloodroot seed, it's this big round seed, and then it's got this like white fleshy part, and that's called an elastosome. And it's basically a fake worm that the plant puts on its seed to entice the ant to carry it into their midden, their ant place. And then that's the food. So they eat that, and then they leave the seed basically in a pile of ant refuse or plant fertilizer. So it's a whole interaction, right? And here, I think I'm making this name up, but those are shiny flower beetles. That's really what the family is called. And they're on one of our fancier goldenrods, one of the wand species, right? And that right there, yes, is a mosquito. So male mosquitoes, only the females bite you, just like with the bees and the wasps. And I'm going to run away from the microphone for a sec, because in the middle of that picture, you can actually see his antenna. Right there. So just like moths have those big fluffy antennae to catch pheromones, so too do male mosquitoes, because they have to be able to sniff out the females. And you'll often see them on white flowers. So that right there is a white goldenrod. You often see mosquitoes pollinating our native orchids. So, of course, as bird people, you all know there's much more than pollinators. There's going to be a bunch. I'll get to the pictures first. So a balanced ecosystem keeps populations in check. If you have a whole bunch of things, if you just have a whole bunch of plants, then it'll be really easy for the things that eat plants to find them, and then they'll destroy your plants. So I've had people all the time say, I hate organic gardening. I stopped using pesticides and all the bugs came and ate my garden. Well, you don't really have any other food for them. And because there aren't places for them to live year round, the predators don't come and hang out. So if you have a hedgerow where you've got your herbivorous insects living there well, not in the winter, they're hibernating in the winter, then the predators are also able to build a population, and the population can be there. And then when there's an issue on your garden, other insects coming in and eating the garden, those predators are hanging out in the hedgerow, they'll come over, and you have kind of it's keeping it in check. So instead of one group of organisms getting way out of control, by having a healthy ecosystem where everybody's functioning there, you don't end up with, keeping on a greater scale, a bunch of rabbits or a bunch of deer. There we go. A bunch of deer destroying everything because we don't have wolves, we don't have effective hunting. So by encouraging more, and it's kind of counterintuitive, if you encourage more and more levels of the ecosystem, they kind of balance each other out and you don't get those big runs of any one thing being a huge problem. And of course, insects are bird food. So the more insects you bring into your yard, the more birds you're going to have being there to feed on them. A woman I know with the Pollinator Pathway Project down in Wilton has found nests with a baby bird starved, surrounded by seed. Because all the parents could bring it was seed, but that baby needs protein to grow up and live. You're not going to survive growing up on millet alone. So we need so much more than just bird feeders to help the birds. So these right here are a kind of fun type of bird food. These are both two different kinds of galls on goldenrod. So we see our garden plants, we don't really like them to look ugly, but that ugliness is really, really important in nature. So the one on the right here is called a rose gall, and I believe that's formed by a midge. The one on the left, or not formed. The midge lays its egg and the plant is induced to create this. It's almost kind of like a pearl situation. The other one there on the left, those are wasps, are what induces the plant to make those stem galls. And now those galls, you can often see them all through the winter on the goldenrod, and that little larva is in there. So any woodpecker or other bird who likes to bust into stuff can go to that and get a meal, a high protein meal all through the winter. So this is one really important reason why, if you are encouraging native plants in your yard, it's not really enough to just have them there and treat them like a regular garden. But if you leave the dead stalks up through the winter, then you have all those important insects being able to survive and provide food and all the other things that they can. So of course, it goes beyond the invertebrates, and we've got wonderful things like these little red efts, which I'm sure you guys see a bit more of them in this part of the state than I do. And if you notice, to his right, you've got a mushy little mushroom there. So mushrooms are also an incredibly important part of the ecosystem, working to break down all the dead wood and dead plant matter. And if you clean all that dead wood and dead plant matter up, there's not going to be anything for those mushrooms to feed on. And then those mushrooms in turn are food for a lot of our small mammals and small, larger insects and small amphibians. So here we've got a spider and a dragonfly and another beautiful dragonfly. And I have to say, the dragonflies are the one thing that I've been absolutely blown away at, the increase in the number of dragonflies on my parents' property where I've been managing this way for the past 3 years now. Dragonflies that it's an acre and a half, probably 15 different species of dragonflies. It's amazing. And this little guy right here is someone you definitely have heard. That's one of our tree crickets. So I just thought it was amazing to actually get to see one of those, because there's so many things we hear all the time, but unless you really spend a lot of time out in nature, you just don't really often get to see most of them. Oh, and of course, we have wonderful little snakes who are the best rodent control you're going to find, and they really don't want to mess with you. And we even have tree frogs, which a lot of people don't realize we have tree frogs here in New England, but we do. These, despite their color, are our gray tree frog. They will get grayer as they get older. All right, so how do we help all these guys? Well, my suggestion is to make it ungarden. So I'm going to run through some steps and then kind of go into a little bit more of the, there are going to be some things I'm going to say. You're like, wait, what do you mean? Don't worry, I'm going to come back to them.
Yeah,
Okay,
the shampoo instead of the conditioner.
the step 0, before you start introducing more native plants into your property, is to develop and start implementing an invasive species removal plan. Because if you don't do that first, all of your work is for nothing, because the invasive plants will just say, thank you very much for this new space. We will take it and it will be ours. So I'm going to get into invasive plants in a sec, but let's just go along with the steps. So the first step of making an ungarden is to designate your area. I'm going to get into with invasive management, how picking possibly that area where you've got a bunch of invasives might be the place where you'll start your ungarden. But this can also be if you've got areas that are really wet and annoying to mow in the spring, or really steep, just those problem areas that aren't parts of your lawn that you use. Lawns are still useful. I'm not saying get rid of lawns, but picking an area that is kind of an edge of the property or an otherwise already annoying space. So you're not losing anything that you would really use. And then the next step is just to let it grow. So you're going to have to identify a lot of things, and a lot of things that you're going to think are weeds and some that are weeds. So once you've identified things, you're going to start the long process of editing. So that's basically just removing invasive species and encouraging native volunteers. So I'm saying some weird words, like I'm questioning the concept of weeds. What even are weeds? How are we going to know what's invasive, what's not? And I've got a bunch of resources for you. Don't worry. But sorry, forgetting the order that I put my slides in. Okay. So I'm going to get into the concept of weeds in a sec, because there are a lot of plants in the world and a lot of native plants. This is their home. They know how to get to the places that are good for them to grow. So for that reason, unfortunately, a lot of times they get a bad reputation, but that doesn't mean that they're bad plants. So once you've kind of just let your area grow and pulled out everything you don't want to be there and allowed the things that are showing up on their own, which are amazing things sometimes, like Canada lilies and flowering dogwoods, which are 2 things that showed up completely on their own in my parents' yard. We'd never had them there before. Once we started removing the invasives and allowing the space, they showed up. Then, and only then, are you going to start buying plants. After about a full year of watching that space, seeing what wants to be there on its own, then you can start planting things in. Because you don't want to duplicate work. You don't want to start doing work before you've got a good space for them to grow. So, okay, and then that's where I stuck that. So you may have noticed on the slide back at the beginning, just kind of talking about what is ungardening. I talk about questioning the land care, the traditional things you do. While we need to look at the ways that we manage gardens and our yards and say, like, is that really what we want to be doing? And sometimes those changes. So this whole ungardening, that's a big change. That's a couple of years project that you're embarking on. But sometimes beneficial changes, you just have to make the decision to do it. So some of those things are turning off your outside lights at night. As bird folks, you're probably all aware of how much that impacts migration. But did you know that many of our moths actually don't even have mouth parts as adults? So all of the eating that they do is done as caterpillars. This is also true for mayflies. But all of what they are going to eat, they consume as larvae. They turn into their moth form, and then their entire job is to find a mate and reproduce and lay those eggs. So if they're spending, and that adult life may be a couple days, maybe a couple weeks, usually isn't much longer than a couple weeks if they don't have any mouth parts to replenish themselves. So if they're spending half of those nights circling around your light bulb, you're really potentially damaging that population. Those animals aren't going to be able to find their mates, breed, and continue on that species. So another thing, again, this is it's a quick thing in words, but definitely requires an understanding of and a change of how you're managing your property. And that is stopping the use of broad spectrum herbicides, pesticides, and rodenticides. Sometimes it's necessary to spray a wasp nest in the corner of your garage, but we don't need to be fogging for ticks or fogging for mosquitoes. And if you do find that you need to use an herbicide for something like Japanese knotweed or autumn olive, some of those really difficult to eradicate invasives, there are directions on the label, and when you follow them, you're actually pretty good. The problem with a lot of these herbicides come from people not using them according to the label directions. Right. And another one that is hard unless it's not hard. So when you get a new kitten, you can institute this. Keep your cats inside or monitor them while they're outside. Studies show cats kill for fun. They don't kill just for the food they need. So no matter how well you feed your cat, no matter how happy they are making them in your home, you cannot stop them from killing birds or rodents or snakes or lizards. And practice good plastic husbandry or avoid it altogether. So if you can go plastic free in your garden, that's best. But if you are still using plastic, keep an eye on it, monitor it when it starts to change, when you start to be able to like scratch it with your fingernail. That means it's degrading, it's turning into other plastics, it's breaking down. It no longer has the properties of the initial thing, which usually if it's made for gardening, it's food safe plastic. Once it starts breaking down, you don't know that if it's food safe plastic anymore. And those bits start falling off and creating all those issues that we have with microplastics. So just keep an eye on your plastic containers. When they start to get busted looking, get rid of them. So what are weeds? Gonna be a little snarky. They're a plant growing where you don't want. So that sounds just a little bratty, but it really is true. It's a plant that has the ability to spread easily into an area where it previously wasn't, grow quickly, and reproduce prolifically in a way that we don't want it to. But these traits are actually really, really important in a native ecosystem. So in their natural habitat, these plants kind of act as a first aid response. So when there's some sort of disturbance, like a big storm throws down trees in the forest and you've got a whole bunch of open light, or there's a mudslide and now you have a whole bunch of open soil. These weeds, these plants that can get to the space really fast or live for a long time in the soil, they pop up and they grow quickly and they cover the ground and they cover that soil and they prevent erosion, because erosion is a really, really bad thing for an ecosystem. It takes a long time for those nutrients to get wetted into the soil, and some instance that's going to come and wash all that away, it's going to really set that ecosystem back. So these plants that grow quickly, spread easily into an area, reproduce prolifically so that they can fill that area in or spread far enough to get to the next area of disturbance. Yeah, when they are doing that in our yards, it's annoying. So many of the native species that are considered weeds are actually our annuals. And I often kind of encounter this to the other side. People say, oh, all the native plants that I see in the garden center are all perennials. I want to grow annuals. Like, well, that's really hard because there's been a smear campaign against them since we colonized this country and they started creeping into our agricultural fields. So things like the flea veins, and I'm going to get into pictures in a bit, but things like the flea veins, the oxeye daisy, the big one that grows along the highway, that's the only wild non-native daisy, really. So anything else you see later in the fall, those little guys that are like an inch across, all of those flea veins are native, those ones that people rail against in their gardens. So just because something is that, especially something is a plant that we call a weed, doesn't mean it's bad. These are really just as beneficial to our native pollinators and everybody else as a perennial. And honestly, some of our perennials are also weeds. So the goldenrods, a classic one that people call weeds, those are perennials, but they still have that ability to spread quickly and they have wind dispersed seeds. So weed and invasive are also not synonyms. There are native and introduced weeds, and not all introduced species are even invasive. So some examples of some native weeds. This one right here is going to be the start of a trend, and that is things in the aster family. So a lot of the asters have wind dispersed seeds, so they're really good at being weedy. This is called fireweed, and It's got weed right there in the name. And it's got the fire because it's common in areas where there have been fires. So the vegetation gets burned down, and then the next year you have fields of this. So that little like green shoot on the side is actually the flower. Right up there at the top of it. And when I say flower, I actually mean flower cluster, because that's about 30 individual flowers. And then we've got an interesting thing going on with the ants feeding on the aphids here. And this right here is a little garden on the side of a driveway in a really suburban area in East Granby. And it was lawn 2 or 3 months before this picture. Another one here, jewelweed. Again, you can kind of hear it in the name. A lot of these have gotten that name because of their behavior and their reputation. So jewelweed, really common one in wet areas, also an annual. This one right here is called spotted eyebane. Are we good with common names, or do we want scientific names? Is common good? Okay. So this one is in the spurge family, and it's a real low-growing mat-forming plant, and you see this all over the place. And it's, I don't like the word ground cover. That to me is almost a synonym with invasive, because if something can be growing in a monocultural way like that, it's probably not great. But this spotted spurge eyebane sand mat is kind of almost a ground cover for really arid areas. And this one, another one in arid areas, is blue curls, the fleabane. So this is one, there are a couple different species, but they're all amazing. And you can actually see basically everything you can see in that picture into the background is all fleabane. This was the first year of one of my, an area I called the thicket, one of my own gardens. We had a whole bunch of multiflora rose. We ripped them out, and probably 80% of it the first year was fleabane. And now maybe 10% of it is, because this is kind of something I skipped when I was talking about how the native annuals, the weedy natives, fill in an area after disturbance. So they hold that area in to stop the erosion, but they're also holding it in and allowing time for other more slow growing plants to get into that space. So eventually then the slow growing plants are a bit more aggressive. They can push out those annuals, and then those annuals need to go spread to another place that has suitable habitat. So what that means is that they're all used to fighting. So in nature, in the wild, the plants need to fight tooth and nail for their space in the ecosystem. In our gardens, we pull plants out and make each nice little space for them. So many of these native annuals, many of the even the native perennials, can definitely outcompete things that are your traditional garden plants. But when you put a whole bunch of natives together, they can find a balance. And this is another one that is a really fun one. It can get up to 15 feet tall. It's called tall blue lettuce. It's a biennial. Yarrow is one of my favorites, and it's got a cute little caterpillar on it. I'm not sure who that is. I think it's a sphinx moth. And this is another one. So the yarrow is also in the aster family, and so is that one on the side, which is called devil's beggar ticks, another really cool native annual. And Virginia creeper. So as bird people, you probably have a bit more positive of an opinion on it than most. Virginia creeper rarely gets bigger than your thumb. It's not going to make big, massive vines like a bittersweet or a poison ivy. So it's totally safe for the tree to let it grow up a mature tree. You don't want to let it grow up small trees or small shrubs, but it's a great one. And so this is growing obviously out on a rock in full sun, and is producing an absolute ton of berries. So we have Virginia creeper growing in our yards. It's down in the shade. It's not doing much. But when it gets up high, it makes a lot of bird food. It's actually in the grape family, so we can't eat the berries, but you can kind of, if you know what young grape looks like, you can kind of get better at distinguishing between Virginia creeper and poison ivy, of course. 5 leaf oats versus 3, but the leaves actually turn red a lot sooner than a lot of other things in the woods, because they're flagging to the birds that the fruit is ripe. So I'm just gonna take a sip of my water. And we'll start talking about invasive species. So an invasive species is one that outcompetes native species in their natural environment. Does not refer to the way that a plant acts in your garden or yard. So most invasive species are weeds, but not all weeds are invasive species. It's just like I said, we're creating a lot of space in our garden. We're basically making simulated disturbance. Every time we weed, we're creating open soil. And if you look outside, except in a desert, even in a desert, I lived in Nevada, and it's not as sparse as people like you to think that deserts are. There's vegetation everywhere. And around here, unless you're at the beach, you're not going to see big patches of open soil. So replicating that in our garden, of course, there are plants that are going to take advantage of that. So many invasive species, invasive plants specifically, were introduced intentionally. With a lot of the insects and a lot of the pathogens, they were accidental and they caused issues. But the plants, we brought them here on purpose and then they caused issues. But what that means is that a lot of them are edible. And I'm not going to get into that much, but I do have a couple books if people are interested in some recommendations. But that can be a really effective way, kind of a nice silver lining over the cloud of invasive species removal. You can at least get a little benefit out of it. So not all introduced species are invasive. There is a list put together by a Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group of things that are legally defined as invasive in Connecticut. But of course, if a non-native species is acting invasively in your yard, I say, take it out. I say it's your yard. If a plant is helpful for you, leave it. If it's annoying for you, take it out. Spearmint's not technically invasive, but if you've got it in your yard, you definitely know how it acts and you definitely want to manage it. So I definitely encourage people to remove as many as possible invasive species, or at the very least stop them from reproducing. But for those ones in that kind of middle ground, it's a middle ground. So who are these invasive species? I'm going to run through a bunch of pictures. This one right here is the vine honeysuckle. And if you know your invasives, you might be a little confused because those are not its leaves. Those are the leaves of Oriental bittersweet behind it, which is another invasive. This one is autumn olive. It's one of those edible ones that has lovely berries in the fall. It is one that has thorns though, so do be careful when removing it. I'm just gonna run through a bunch of pictures and then kind of go through what's the word for this? Flow chart of invasive species removal. So this is one that surprises a lot of people. Periwinkle, Vinca minor is an invasive species. I'm not actually sure if it's technically in Connecticut, but in Maryland and a bunch of southern states, it is legally considered invasive. And if you've ever tried to remove it, you'll understand why. It definitely makes itself at home. And you can look out in the woods and see where there were homesteads. The house is gone, but the Vinca is still there. This one right here, another one beloved by the landscape professionals, our burning bush. Again, that's in bloom, that one just finished blooming. And that's actually a really great example of what I was saying earlier, how non-native species often leaf out sooner. Now we've got our native things leafing out in the woods, but about a month ago, almost all that green you were seeing was burning bush. So we've got over here the other honeysuckle, one of the shrub ones, that's Max honeysuckle. This is, sorry, only the scientific names are coming to my head. This is Persicaria. Porcelainberry? No, that's the grape one. Oh my goodness. Mile a minute. Thank you. Yeah. It's like being bilingual. Fans are bilingual. You can only think of the Spanish word. You can't think of the English word. It's like that with the scientific names. I've got you on the science. Don't have the common. All right. We do have a few invasive grasses. This is one called Japanese stiltgrass, Microstygium. Wineberry. Another one. Super delicious. Get every single berry you can possibly pick and don't poop outside after you've eaten them. Another grass is called velvet fog. That's a commonly an ornamental one. And that's one, it's not very palatable to animals. So if it's growing in a pasture, after a number of years, it'll often be one of the major grasses because the animals will selectively eat the other grasses. This is not phlox. This is Dame's rocket. Phlox is spelled with 5 letters and it has 5 petals. Dame's rocket is in the mustard family and it has 4 petals. Also blooms about a month earlier. One of the only invasive sedge I'm going to mention is yellow nut sedge. That one there. The beach rose, our beach roses that everybody loves, are also an invasive species. But if you want to gather roses to do rose petal anything, you can. They're an invasive species as long as you don't step on the dune. The state parks are happy to have you gather them and the hips. So I've done it a lot, and it's funny, you like have the rangers come watch you, make sure you're not doing anything wrong, and they see what you're doing and they just leave. So it's a great way to make something useful. And then one of the common ones are garlic mustard. So that right there is the perfect stage for gathering for edibility. It's rather bitter, but there's a bunch of different recipes. This one is called Asiatic dayflower. It's an annual. Black swallow wort. And this one's particularly dangerous because it is in the same family as the milkweed. So the monarchs will sometimes lay their caterpillars on it, but then it actually has other toxins or too much of the toxins, and it will kill the caterpillars when they try to feed on it. This is privet. The hedge privet is invasive in you guys actually, it's worse up here than it is in the center part of the state. So that might be more common. And mugwort, another absolutely miserable one. One of the ones that it truly can be worth it to use herbicides. But it will, if you are going to try to go about it another way, you really do want to either repeatedly mow or dig, not pull, because every little bit of root will become another plant. So if you pull a plant out and you turn that one root into two, now you've got two plants. This one is actually a little bit of a success story. So this is purple loosestrife, and they have released a weevil that manages it. And if you've noticed, the populations go down in the past few years of this plant, that's actually why. Creeping Charlie, plant in the mint family, and this is garlic mustard in bloom. So now that you know who we're talking about with the invasive species, I'm gonna run through this flow chart. So, because sometimes, a lot of times, when I go to people's yards, one thing I do is I do yard consultations. So I'll come out and basically botanize someone's yard, tell them all the plants they have and how they should best manage it. And a lot of people get really disheartened and like, I have so many invasive species, where do I start? What do I do? So this is the kind of flow chart if you're looking at your yard going, oh God, these are the questions you can ask to try to figure out your priorities. So is anything in blooming or in seed? Because the best thing you can do is to stop reproduction as much as possible. So if something's in seed, is it a large patch? If it's not, for forbs, so that's non-woody plants, you want to remove the whole plant. A lot of these plants, if they're in flower, even if you pull it up, it can still ripen and those seeds will ripen. So garlic mustard is a classic one. You can pull up a garlic mustard that has no seeds on it, but if it's in bloom, that plant will develop ripe seeds out of the ground. So for shrubs, if it's a small area, you can remove the seeds and flowers and then cut the plant as close to the ground as possible or dig out. If it's a large patch and it's shrubs, you want to remove as many of the flowers and seeds as possible. But if not, just brush hog the vegetation and leave it on site. If you can remove the stuff and then brush hog, that's better. But brush hogging it and leaving it on site, it's going to make it a bit less appetizing for the birds. If it's all on the ground, it'll be a little bit better for spreading it all around. And if it's not shrubs, or you've got a large patch, you can simply mow with a bag attachment. And then say I've got these astracees, and what that means is you want to dispose of the material in a way it can't spread. So you can eat it, you can feed it to livestock like chickens. That's one of my favorite things to do. You can compost it in an enclosed system. You can dry it and burn it, which is good, but you're then releasing carbon into the atmosphere. Or you can dispose of it in landfill waste. Almost every town I know of allows you to throw away reproductive materials of invasive species with your regular like household landfill waste. Don't put it in the yard waste. I don't know how it works up here. I know down in Durham, all that yard waste gets chipped up and people can come take it. So you don't want to put your invasive species into that because then it could just be spreading all around your yard. Roots and stems of most species can be dried and then composted, but you don't want to do that if there's any potential for seeds. So if nothing's going in seed, you want to go to things that are in bud, basically treat it the same way. If it's a large patch of shrubs, vines, or trees, cut or brush hog and leave those materials in sight. For vines, you don't need to worry about yanking them out of the trees. That'll actually cause more harm than good because it'll break branches, and that is not great for a tree. If they're not shrubs, trees, or vines, you can mow and just leave that material back on site, just mulching it into the area. If it is not a large patch, you can hand pull, and as long as it's not going to start blooming, you can leave those to dry and then compost. So if nothing's in seed or in flower, you're very, very lucky. And the next thing to look at is if anything's growing near water, because a lot of aquatic invasive species can spread. They don't need traditional reproductive material to spread. A bit can break off and then that can root. So if there are, you want to remove the entire plant. And if there's not, we're going on to trees, shrubs, and vines. So this is kind of a little redundant, but again, if you've got trees, shrubs, and vines that aren't in flower and fruit, cut and leave on the site and leave the vines and the trees. If there are large monospecific patches of herbaceous plants, so that means you just got that invasive, there's nothing in there that you want to protect. So if there, I wish I did that the other way around. All right, I'll say yes. So if there are, you want to smother that area with a tarp or sheet mulch. So sheet mulching is basically you mow the area, or you don't have to if you have enough dirt to weigh it down, but it's good to mow the area just to impact the plants a little bit more. Lay down cardboard, lay down topsoil, and then mulch, or just mulch. You want to do the topsoil mulch if you're going to want to be planting onto that, but you can just do the mulch if you don't care and you're just trying to smother the plants. If you have areas that aren't monospecific, you'll want to just keep pulling and digging and leaving them out to compost, leaving them out to dry, and then you can compost or just leave them on site. One of my favorite little things to do if I'm like hiking or stuff and I pull invasives is just hang them upside down in the trees and the roots will dry out. And it's not great at scale, but it can be a pretty effective thing if you're just like, I can't leave that plant there. So there's a couple other things you want to consider when you're figuring out what invasive species to prioritize. So this one's a little counterintuitive, but if there are any small populations, it's great to get those under control before you go on and manage the big ones, because then you don't have something that is a small problem getting out of control while you're trying to manage the big problem. It's kind of triage. Are any growing near, but not yet in your neighbor's yard? Because if you have a neighbor that's on board, that's fine. But if you're going to have to then also figure out how to have the conversation of allowing you to go into their yard, just take care of it before that's the issue. So when cutting but not removing roots, you want to be sure to monitor for resprouts. So I have successfully killed multiflora rose and honeysuckle both by just cutting them down and just watching when they grow back. I cut it down again. When they grow back, I cut it down again. After doing that for about 2 years, the plant's either totally dead or the roots have atrophied enough that I can then yank out ones I wasn't able to yank out before. This can be great if they're growing in rocky areas and stuff. And be honest with yourself. Sometimes it's okay to use herbicides if you're doing it appropriately, and that's going to make it so you can take care of an invasive species in a year instead of 10 years. We only have as much labor as we have. Right. So a few exceptions, mugwort is best removed, like I said, by digging or repeated mowing. The hand pulling can make it worse. And autumn olive is another one that if you have that, it's worth it just to go straight to the herbicides because they don't care. They love it. They will resprout like nobody's business. You can actually sometimes see a field of autumn olive that's been brush hogged will be way more dense the next year. All right. So these are some of my favorite resources. The Connecticut Botanical Society is a pretty good website. It doesn't actually have all of our native species. So sometimes there are gaps, but it's got really great pictures. It's got a great page where it's organized by color. So by family and by color. So you can go and just scroll. If you have a yellow flower, but that's all you know, you can just scroll through a big page of yellow flowers and it'll probably be there. The things that they're missing tend to be the less showy things. Go Botany is by the Native Plant Trust, formerly New England Wildflower Society. This website does have everything, but it is a little overwhelming to use, but it's got some great keys. So it's got a dichotomous key, which is awesome. You can take from knowing nothing, but this is a plant, and then it'll ask you a series of, is it like this or like this questions, and it'll get you to an answer. And there's a bunch of other ways you can utilize that website. This is the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group website, which I mentioned earlier, and they have great fact sheets on all of the invasive species that we have in Connecticut, and great invasive identification and like species specific removal recommendation. Now I know we're not in Illinois or Minnesota, but these are two really amazing websites. So Illinois Wildflowers, of course, they don't have all of our species because they're not quite here, but what they have the most complete information of any other website I've seen. So Illinois Wildflowers has a lot of really great information on the faunal associations. So what insects feed on what plants? Really comprehensive. And Minnesota Wildflowers, if you're a very ambitious person who wants to get into sedge and grass and rush IDs, Minnesota Wildflowers has the best info that you're going to be able to find for free. As far as the apps, I know there's a ton of them. Seek is my favorite. It is by iNaturalist, but iNaturalist is kind of an overwhelming app. It's kind of, I think, on the level of like eBird, where it's like you're recording individual sightings and stuff, and it's getting verified by experts. Whereas Seek is one of the computer learning ones, but it's using all of that expert knowledge from iNaturalist. All right, and oh, that's really hard to read, that blown up. And this is my information. I have a website. I'm also on Facebook.